So Emma Frost drops in Marvel Rivals today. Pretty sure it's today. And so I thought it'd be a great time to cover the origin story of Emma Frost in Marvel Comics because it's really tragic, but really interesting at the same time. Now, this is coming from the X-Men Origins comic, right? Which is a line of comics that Marvel did where they gave us like these one-shot origins for different members of the X-Men community. And initially this opens up with Emma Frost working as a stripper, quite literally, right, in the Hellfire cabaret. We'll talk about why that matters here in a minute. But the reality here is that she is despised by the people who were there because as a stripper, she's not very talented and all anybody really wants to see is her naked. So they're just like, take it all off, right? Like, hurry up. Or we have no interest in seeing you just like dance around and be goofy. And for a moment, she lashes out and she attacks everybody with her telepathic powers. And so what that does is it actually switches back to when she was younger. And it kind of talks about these instances where she's had these sort of moments of high duress and her powers manifested and she attacked the people around her. And that is an important thing to understand, right? For those of you guys who are new to the idea of mutant mythos, mutant powers only manifest under one of three circumstances: puberty, which is 99% of the time, a moment of high duress, which is an explanation for why powers might activate before puberty, but usually moments of high duress and puberty go hand in hand, right? A very anxiety-induced moment at a time when a person's body is changing. The third way that it happens is someone's powers are activated by somebody else at some point in time. That rarely ever happens, but sometimes it does. And so switching back to her younger days, you actually find out that Emma Frost comes from a very abusive household, and her father, Winston Frost, was by all standards of measurement a prick. That's the official name for what this guy was. He was always hard and abusive on his daughter, right? In the sense that like she's like a young girl and she's playing with dolls and she's like reading them a story. Reading the story of Sleeping Beauty, is what she's doing here. But then like her father busts in and just starts screaming at her. Right? He's like, playing your little fantasy games with the dolls again, are we? A perfect recipe for a feeble mind and underachievement. Certainly not worthy of a Frost. Do you really think that you can just wait until you're an adult to get serious about life and a career? Do you think you'll be able to just coast along on daddy's money until you find yourself? I do not indulge laziness or failure. The only way to make it in this world is to work hard and to be the absolute best. Perhaps you ought to spend more time learning how to look pretty like your sister Adrienne, or else cease your foolish play and decide to become something more than a simpering buck-toothed patsy. Now, here is something that I want to specify here in this particular origin story. This does not go in depth about Adrienne, Cordelia, or Christian, the brothers and sisters of Emma Frost. It focuses almost exclusively on her. But to kind of tie this in here, right, the idea was that Christian ended up turning to drug abuse due to the fact that his father was so abusive to everybody in the family. And then ultimately he kills Winston Frost, right? He kills his father, the father of Emma. The other thing is that all the members of the Frost family, all the daughters and the son, Christian, they all have powers, right? They are all mutants in their own way. But Emma Frost is the most well-known out of all of them. But again, kind of focusing on the story in the here and now. If you guys are interested in seeing more about that, let me know. I have no qualms covering that. But kind of switching back to the main story itself, Emma Frost, of course, goes to her mother and talks about how her father's cross with her. And this is a very telling exchange between the two because her mother says things like, well, it's just his way. You just learn how to deal with it after a while. The reality here is everybody's just kind of accepted this fate, right? The idea of Emma telling her mother, father's been cross with me again, and it made me really, really sad. It happens all the time. The guy's just a very, very terrible person. Now, at the same time, her mother is not a horrible human being. I mean, she is an enabler as she allows it all to happen, but she tries to comfort her daughter where she can. And one of the things she tells Emma is the reason why her father is so hard on her is because her father loves her more than everybody else. Now, how true that statement is, right, we would never really know for sure, and it's most likely just the comfort of a mother to a struggling daughter. But at that point, you pick up with Emma Frost in the 9th grade. And as most of you guys know, while middle school is going to be the hardest years of your life, right, high school can be very difficult difficult too, because you're talking about a time in our lives when we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're going, we don't know what we're about, right? The most important thing to us is the acceptance of the people around us, because we haven't quite figured out that the world is a lot bigger than the approval of a bunch of kids our age. And so at this point in Emma's life, she is very, very impressionable. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say that anything untoward happens to her, she is subject to ridicule by the other girls at school. But there is this cool instance where she kind of writes this term paper, and because the term paper is so incredibly well done, she reads it to the entire class. Now for Emma Frost, this is of course a massive achievement, but for the other girls around her who were jealous, it's a way to continue ridiculing her. But then when she gets back home and she tells her family what it is that she had achieved, her father chastises her. He dismisses this entire achievement, right? He says, "Do you really think reading some sentimental pap to a room full of children is supposed to be an achievement?" And Emma kind of stands up for herself, right? Starts to find her own voice. And she's like, "I'm not going to let you discourage me with this, father. I can do this and do it well. It will be a triumph." And the response of her father here is, "Whether you succeed or fail in this pathetic venture is of no consequence. If you fail, they will mock you. And if you succeed, they will be jealous of you and seek to tear you down. The only goal worth seeking is not the approval of others, but power over them." Now, as much as Emma would love to dismiss the thought process of her father, what's going to be so interesting about this is she effectively adopts it as time goes on. And that's usually how it works, right? You know, when we're at that age, we're very impressionable when it comes to our parents, and whether we intend to or not, we oftentimes adopt the mannerisms they have, both good and bad. And so she ultimately storms off, right? She's like, "I don't want to be a Frost. I want to be just like everybody else." And the response of her father is, "You will never be like everybody else. Your money, your family, your very DNA sets you apart. There is no hope of some utopian coexistence you have cooked up in your fantasies. Gain as much power as possible and use it. That is the only way for our kind." Now, something to understand here, and this is one of the things that the origin story kind of leaves out from the traditional Emma Frost mythos. Winston Frost does not have powers. So when Winston Frost is saying things like our kind and so on and so forth, he's not really referring to the nature of them being a mutant or anything along those lines. In fact, as far as I'm aware, throughout the entire Emma Frost mythos, Winston didn't know that his children were mutants developing powers. What he's talking about here is class structure, right? That he's the CEO of Frost International, but he's also a member of the Hellfire Club. And we'll talk about what the Hellfire Club means here in a minute, because we do tie into that. But when he says our kind and you are not like them, basically there's the normal people who exist out there in the world, and then there's those of us who are of a higher social bracket. So what you're talking about here is just extreme arrogance, right? And narcissism. That's really all this is. And so one of the things that goes on is that while Emma Frost is back in school again, a couple of these girls are like, "Hey, you know, wait up, right? It's so cool that you're doing this speech, right? It's really awesome. We just wanted to wish you luck," right? And what ends up happening is that one of the girls slips a piece of paper into her backpack. And so when Emma Frost goes to open it up, she ends up just kind of seeing this piece of paper that's written, right? Emma Frost is a flat-chested, zit-faced nerd who has to get her father to buy her a boyfriend, right? It's pretty taunting. Right? It's pretty intense, and things happen exactly the way that you would expect them to. It's like a scene out of Carrie, right? In that moment, Emma is so stressed out, and she's so anxious, and she's so angry, her powers lash out, and she attacks the entire school. Like, everybody in the school gets hit by this telepathic blast that she sends out. Now, she doesn't kill anybody, right? She doesn't like destroy anybody's mind or anything like that, but it's the first time that she starts to realize these quote unquote migraines that she's been getting are not simply just headaches. There's something bigger going on here. And so of course, this leads to the arrival of Professor Charles Xavier. Now, when Xavier shows up here to meet with Emma, this is also during the time of Moira McTaggart. We won't go super in-depth into this, but for those of you guys who recall everything Hickman did with like the kind of reworking of Moira's character, it totally changes the way that you see this comic. But if you're not familiar with that, it doesn't really change anything functionally, you know, as far as your understanding of Emma's origin goes here. But Xavier shows up the way he always does, right? As this guy who's like, look, I have a special school for mutants, so on and so forth. What's cool about this is that while Emma's laying in bed, she's mulling over everything that had happened, right? You know, like, oh my God, there's people here. Are they the police? Do they know what I did? Am I in trouble? And Xavier communicates with it. And that's what Xavier always does when it comes to mutants that he encounters for the very first time. He usually kind of sits back for a minute or two before he ever even makes an appearance or even arrives on the scene. He kind of reads their mind. He figures out what kind of person they are before he steps up. Now, all of that is rooted in his experience with the Shadow King, because in Marvel Comics, the Shadow King was the first mutant Xavier came across, at least as the Shadow King was presented at that point in time. It was the first time he came across a force where he realized some beings out there are just malevolent. They're not misguided mutants like Magneto who are willing to do the wrong thing to achieve what they believe to be an honorable goal. No, the Shadow King, that guy's just a dick, right? That's really all it is. He is just a straight up villain and nothing more. But because Xavier learned that lesson, and in fact, that was his whole inspiration for creating the X-Men in the first place, at least from the old Chris Claremont era anyway, that he always just kind of rests and he just sort of waits and sees what the mutant is about. In the case of Emma, she's not a bad person. She's not some mutant who discovers she had the power of telepathy and she's like, now I can bend the world to my whim, ha 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 ha, evil laugh, right? It's not really anything like that, it's one of these things where she's just a young girl who's confused about what it was that happened. She's trying to figure herself out, all that kind of stuff. And so where she's sitting here mulling over everything, Xavier telepathically communicates with her and says, we do know what it was that you did, Emma, but you are not in trouble. Mostly because she didn't kill anybody, right? And he says, don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. I'm a telepath just like you. I am a mutant like you. And he says, I'm downstairs. My friend and I came here to talk to you and your father about my school. It's a school for mutant children, for gifted children like you. And your father is currently turning down my offer. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with the story of Emma Frost, right off the bat, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Emma never joined the X-Men. She never became a part of Xavier's school initially. She did later on when she led Generation X, but that was years later, right after a particular event that we'll talk about here in a second. And that's kind of carried on here, right? So don't worry, your concerns are not invalid. And so as she's sort of eavesdropping over everything that's happening, right, her father's just like, a stranger presumes he knows my child better than I. That's ridiculous. And so Xavier, continuing to communicate telepathically with Emma, he says, it doesn't have to be this way. You have an incredible amount of power inside of you, but that power needs training, honing. And with that, I can help you. You know enough of how our powers work to know that I can change your father's mind, right? I can show him the error of his ways. And in response, Emma is like, do not touch my father. Now, here's an important thing to know here, right? Is Emma as powerful as Jean Grey? No. But is she more powerful than Xavier? Yes. If the X-Men tie-ins for Civil War are to be believed, where the statement was made that she is a more powerful psychic than Professor Xavier, then that would kind of establish where she resides here. But the fact is, when she comes downstairs, she rebukes the offer of Xavier, because truth to tell, the approval of her father means more to her than potentially escaping all of this stuff. But there's also a very important moment that goes on here, because in this attempt to gain the approval of her father lashes out, right? Don't ever eavesdrop on me. And that's when she starts to realize, given these powers I have, I can do anything I want, right? She says, I thought in that moment, I could burn your mind out, Father, leave you a vegetable. You never be able to harass or hurt me again. But how is that any different than what you would do? And so what she started to learn is she can use her powers to manipulate. She can use her powers to do what she wants. Now, in reality here, if we're talking about Jean Grey's powers versus Emma Frost's powers, more recently in the X-Men Red comic, I think it was established that that little difference is what separates Emma from Jean. It's why Emma is not as powerful as Jean Grey is. Jean uses her powers to help people, which constantly forces her to use her powers in new ways that she'd never thought of before, constantly pushing her limits because the forces of evil are ever encroaching. But for someone like Emma, she uses her powers for her own individual gains, and the minds of your average person are easily manipulated. So she's never really pushing her powers to the limits, right? Never really pushing her powers to the extreme. And that's why she never really seems to be on the same level as Jean, outside of a couple stories, right? The Phoenix Endsong and Warsong stories where she became the White Phoenix of the Crown momentarily and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that goes on is we end up switching back to the modern era, right? When she was in the cabaret. And as she's there and she was being booed off the stage and so on and so forth, Sebastian Shaw comes running in, right? Now he's the current leader, the Black King of the Hellfire Club. And in this moment, when the two of them are just kind of going back and forth, he's literally taunting her, right? He's just like, think I wouldn't notice you scampering about my brain. I'm not one of your helpless Hellfire buffoons. Do not ever enter my mind without my permission, and immediately grabs her head and smashes it into a table, right? And at that point, Emma's just like, I will kill you where you stand. And like, her powers just lash out and she attacks Sebastian. And that's when he's like, that's what I've been waiting for. I've been waiting for this moment when you finally just let your powers run free and you stop holding back, right? You use your powers to gain power, to attain power, to control people. That's what I was looking for. And so what he does is he brings her into the Hellfire Club. Now, the Hellfire Club in Marvel Comics is this secretive organization. It's almost like a super elite class. So think of it as like a kind of an Illuminati type thing. But instead of the Illuminati looking to protect the world by sharing information behind the scenes, of course, the Illuminati being Professor Xavier and Reed Richards and Doctor Strange and Namor and Black Bolt and Captain America at one point in time, Black Panther, and Tony Stark as well, that the idea behind the Hellfire Club is they look to control the world behind the scenes by influencing governments, influencing various officials, CEOs, so on and so forth, right? In their mind, yes, they all have powers, and those powers can be used for various goals, but the real control when it comes to the world is money. And so Emma Frost starts using her abilities to amass massive amounts of wealth and contributing that wealth to the Hellfire Club and indulging in the various things that the Hellfire Club has to offer, both interesting, creative, as well as hedonistic, and she really earns her role as the White Queen of the Hellfire Club, both in terms of speech and in terms of deed, right? She performs well with Sebastian Shaw, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. But what she does is she sits down and she says, okay, so the X-Men have their school, we should have our school, and this is the formation of the Hellions. Now, to say that the Hellions were the answer to the X-Men is actually probably an incorrect statement on my part. The Hellions were really more of an answer to the New Mutants, because again, one of the things the origin doesn't include is that at this point in time when the Hellion school was formed by Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club, that the X-Men were believed to be dead. And so Xavier formed the New Mutants as a kind of new X-Men team. Now, of course, it ended up turning out the X-Men were actually alive and the whole Brood Saga thing and yada, yada, yada. And so after that, you basically had two X-Men teams running around. You had the Uncanny X-Men, you had the New Mutants. Shortly after that, you get X-Factor, which is the original Stan Lee, Jack Kirby X-Men who were brought back as a whole new team when Jean Grey returns after the Dark Phoenix saga and all that kind of stuff. What matters is this. In Uncanny X-Men 281 and 282, this was a story where the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club, a character named Selene, who's an external that siphons the life force off of people, that she had basically brought in the upstarts. And the upstarts were led by Trevor Fitzroy, the idea being that she wanted to test the members of the Hellfire Club, and specifically she wanted to test Emma Frost and the Hellions. What followed was a massive assault from Trevor Fitzroy and his upstarts. Trevor Fitzroy being a time-traveling mutant that actually came from the future of Bishop in Marvel Comics, if you're familiar with this character. If you're not, it's not a great big huge deal. The bigger point of this that I'm making is that during this massive battle with the upstarts, most of the Hellions were killed, and Emma Frost took it as a massive failure on her part. And so because of that, she actually ended up abandoning the whole idea of the Hellfire Club and then joined the X-Men and ultimately led Generation X. That was a comic that was launched in like 1993, and it was like a 1993 reworking of the original New Mutants concept combined with like the original Stan Lee, Jack Kirby X-Men concept. And it was cool. It was fun for what it was, right? Ran for like 100 some odd issues, I'm pretty sure. It wasn't the greatest comic there ever was, but you know, it did its job. But again, at this time, she's simply just training the Hellions and teaching them how to become more capable mutants. But one of the things that goes on here is she adopts the philosophy of her father. Instead of championing their successes and telling them these are things that we can work on in regards to their failures, instead, she only highlights their failures. She only focuses on what they've done wrong and almost never tells them what it is that they got right. It's an exact mirror of the things her father taught her. And that's why I say, as people, whether we consciously or subconsciously do it, we oftentimes carry around the wounds and the lessons of our upbringings all the way into adulthood unless we recognize and take care of those things. And for Emma Frost, she never did. For her, she adopted the philosophy of her father. Power is the only thing that matters. More so than that, power over people. And so creating the Hellions was a way for her to maintain power over a group of her own without actually having children, and then in turn, control their destinies and their fates. And she even kind of sees the illusion of her father, but just dismisses it. And it's like, well, I'm doing what's necessary, right? I'm doing what needs to be done, that kind of thing. And so again, while all this takes place before the death of the Hellions, the story ends kind of book-ending into Emma's first appearance in Marvel Comics when the X-Men are kidnapped by the Hellfire Club, leading into the Phoenix Saga, leading into the Dark Phoenix Saga. This actually took place between the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, and Emma Frost greeting them. And of course, the massive battle ensues after that, and, Jean Grey becomes the Dark Phoenix. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, if you guys want a more in-depth origin of Emma Frost, let me know, and just, we'll kind of go from there. But thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.